NTV.
All right, Sydney, thanks for that report. But time to take a look at what's also making headlines on our dailies this morning. I'm not alone in studio. I am joined by Irungu Houghton, Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya. Very good morning. Good to see you. We also have John Waiganjo, Commissioner, Independent Policing Oversight Authority, that is IPOA. Very good morning to you.
Good morning.
Karibu sana. It would have been a different Wednesday over the past 2 weeks. You would have been thinking, how do I get to the CBD? However, today is quite different. And this is what we have captured on the Daily Nation front page. Searching for a deal. The genesis, a dispute over the outcome of the 2022 elections led by the protests, with the opposition Azimio la Umoja coalition putting out a list of demands to the government to lower the cost of living, to hold the unilateral reconstitution of IBC, to respect a multi-party democracy, and to audit IBC servers with a view of enhancing electoral justice in the country. Azimio now says the protests are on the high cost of living. Well, is there dialogue in the offing? Opposition leader Raila Odinga yesterday acknowledging high-level behind-the-scenes efforts to end the protests over the high cost of living and the row over the 2022 elections, revealing that an attempt by a neighboring head of state to mediate over the dispute proved futile, even as they accused President William Ruto of resisting talks. But while State House remained mum, the President's allies denied any such visit happened. Meanwhile, the international community is ramping up its bid to bring the rival camps back to the negotiating table. Irungu, I mean, this is perhaps a light at the end of the tunnel. I don't know how you make of some of these developments so far.
I think Kenyans can be relieved that, first of all, today that we are not facing another round of violence. That's the first sense of relief. Second is that we are seeing signs now of the beginnings of a mediated dialogue. And that dialogue needs to focus not just on the political questions that the political parties have been concerned with, but also on the economic grievances that most Kenyans are experiencing. I think the key thing for people, most people, is whether the Taxation Act will be implemented. Of course, it's still, I believe, still within court. But the concerns really are living costs. It's just unbearable for millions of people. That's the biggest concern for Kenyans at this point.
Bwana Waiganjo, what do you make of this?
Well, it's a huge relief, particularly to some of the institutions that were overstretched by the protests. I see it as a light at the end of the tunnel, although it should have come sooner. We have lost lives, we have lost property, but at the end of it all, I think we are headed to the right direction. We urge more of this, because when the protests happen, the right does not know what the left is doing. There is always a possibility of a clash within government institutions which are mandated, perhaps to oversight the work of the National Police Service, like ourselves. So it really is a very huge relief for us. We were getting overstretched, and we were wondering how we would move forward if this persisted.
All right. And let's see what else we have here on the Daily Nation. Just very quickly as well, before we get into a conversation. Okay, let me try and fix my paper there. All right, there you have it. Raila company in plan to build 500 million luxury hotel in Kilifi. You can find that on the second page of the DN. Also, former Governor Samboja returns to radio. It's a third page of the Daily Nation. Former county boss's return to the limelight has ignited speculation over his intention. Is kept quite a low profile, and 10 is the number of months since his last year's election, in which Granton Samboja lost to Governor Andrew Madime. He has kept quite a low profile. Is it a comeback? You can have a look at that report as well. Also, search for a deal inside efforts to break Raila Ruto impasse. What captured on the front page of the DN. But also, what is a matter of interest for us, and the conversation we'll perhaps be having a little bit later on or in a moment. One police officer killed, 305 injured in anti-government protests, says the principal secretary in the Interior Ministry. And he says that there has been one police officer so far who was killed and 305 injured during last week's anti-government protests. And the PS said, that is Principal Secretary Raymond Omolo. And Omolo says the officer died while on duty and that the injuries to the other officers were serious. He adds that investigations were underway to determine whether civilians were carrying firearms and whether they contributed to the injuries and fatalities. And he says, and we'll be having a discussion on this, that Apparently, there's the new trend of negatively profiling, harassing, and attacking security personnel saw a total of that amount of law enforcement officers, 305 seriously injured and 1 who died. He says investigations are underway to determine whether civilians are carrying firearms and whether they contributed to the injuries and fatalities. And just to also introduce into the studio Professor Marion Mutugi, Commissioner from the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. A very good morning. Good to see you, and thank you for joining us as well this morning on AM Live. But I'll begin with you, Bonawe Ganjo, on this. So this is a statement that was released yesterday. I think I actually have that statement somewhere here. Yes, that's from the Cabinet Secretary, but we do have that statement from the PS. And, you know, he's mentioned a number of things, specifically just touching on the fact that one police officer was killed, 305 seriously injured, and a lot of destruction that happened under the hands of civilian, he says. What do you make of this? I mean, this is, you know, when we have had allegations of police using excessive force and, you know, police meeting brutality against demonstrators and protesters. But the, you know, the Interior Ministry says, but, you know, our people are also suffering.
That's true. Our preliminary investigations has revealed that even the police were under a lot of pressure from the protesters. And it's true. We have police officers who are injured by protesters. And I know you saw, I mean, protesters using stones and slings. Those are dangerous weapons, if you ask me. It's just equivalent to a bullet. And sometimes the protesters overwhelmed the police officers. And in some instances, the police officers did not even have proper facilities to counter the protesters. We saw instances where the police ran out of tear gas, putting their life in danger. So it's true, both ways. In fact, the Sabasaba protests were very violent, but that is not to say that the subsequent ones were not. So what the CS is saying is true. What we would have loved to see also is the other side of the coin, at how many protesters were also killed. And
because, you know, at this point, we have an official figure.
Yeah, for the protesters, because that's where our mandate goes, we have confirmed at least 24 deaths. This is proper confirmation because we have reached out to their next of kin. You know, we have evidence, we have witnesses who have recorded statements. So I can confidently say that we know for a fact that 24 is a confirmed number. Although we still continue to carry out our investigations. We have wrote to the Inspector General of Police to also give us appropriate and proper figures from their end, because we have not been receiving notifications. And you know, by law, the National Police Service Act requires the police to notify the authority within 24 hours of any deaths caused by police action. So unfortunately, we haven't received those notifications. So we have sought from the IG to give us and to urge the commanders to give us the notification so that we can have appropriate numbers of the police officers who are injured also. Because it is also our responsibility to carry out that data so that when we are talking about professionalizing the police service, we know for a fact where we are coming from. We have not, unfortunately, received any response in that regard. All
right. And you know, we're going to get into that conversation much deeper. Professor Marion, we saw the statement from KNCHR yesterday with regard to what it terms as excessive force by police. And of course, what you talk about is a number of things, including, you know, investigations into a police killer squad. We'll get into that, but just your overview of this statement from the Interior Ministry. They're saying one police officer has been killed, a lot of police officers also injured in the process. This is the other side of the coin as well.
Thank you very much. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights mandate is to promote and protect the human rights of everybody. Police officers are Kenyans, they are humans, and therefore our mandate covers promoting and protecting their rights. So it is unfortunate, it is sad, and we're reminiscent with all of those police officers who are injured and the families of this particular one who died, including also even the protesters, because they are also human.
All right. Bwana Irungu, what do you make sense of this?
So as Amnesty International, we would stand by our statement last week that the protest had taken extremely violent direction. I think the statement by the Principal Secretary of the Interior, was derided yesterday because he focused primarily on the impact on police officers, police stations, shops, assaults on police officers and the roads that were blocked, but failed to give a comprehensive picture. Right. And I think we have to say that they're not two sides of a coin. There's only one side on this one, which is how many people got hurt, how many people were killed, and how much damage there is. And I think what we need to see is more data like this, but more data in the sense that I would be very happy to see the Principal Secretary also give us data on the number of protesters that were injured and killed. I think also we could request the Interior PS for a series of data points. First of all, how many notifications were made by protest organizers over the last 3 months? So if we take March to July, how many protest organizers notified the police? The police have that data. The second one is how many protesters have been arrested and what are the charges that are being applied in each of their cases? How many were killed and where were they killed and under what circumstances were they killed? What are the injuries that have been recorded by the National Police Service in terms of all Kenyans, not just police officers, but civilians? And civilians will be people who were involved in the protests, bystanders, and people who, as they say, were shot, basically accidentally. So we need to see all those figures in the context. I would be interested to see, as Amnesty, for example, how many tear gas canisters have been flung over the last 3 months? How many water cannon trucks? How much water has been used? What is the content of the water that people have been sprayed with for the last 3 months? And it would be important, I think, from a well-being perspective to understand how many police officer hours have been spent policing the protests, because I think one of the things we have to say is that policing protests is a well-being concern, because it is an extremely intense moment, not just for protesters but even for police officers. So this is the kind of data analysis that would be useful for the nation at this time, because then we would be able to see what has actually happened, and that data should be verifiable. So it would be important to have enough detail so that the independent offices can go back and verify what is being put out in the public domain. It's probably not enough to simply say, X number of vehicles, Y number of police stations. We need details. And I think that would help all of us to understand the magnitude of what has just happened. And I'm speaking in the past tense, hopefully. But at least what it would also allow us to think about how do we better police protests in future, because there are lots of lessons that need to be learned.
Indeed. Comprehensive data on these protests and demonstrations. We'll get back to that conversation in a little while as I take a look at also what's happening here. In the Daily Nation, time is running out for bipartisan talks. Kenya Kwanza tells Azimio. That's the Kenya Kwanza bipartisan talks team, which is once again invited the Azimio la Umoja One Kenya counterparts to return to the negotiating table, warning that time is running out. The team, led by Tharaka MP George Murugara, says they are still waiting to engage with the Azimio side to find solutions to their grievances. And he was addressing journalists at Parliament buildings yesterday, saying the talks were only suspended by Azimio and not dissolved. So there is still a window for the talks. But we do have, I believe, a statement from the Azimio side, but the call for resumption of talks comes almost 2 months after the Azimio side of the 14-member committee suspended the talks indefinitely, accusing Murugara of failing to sign 2 letters addressed to the chairperson of the selection panel, Nelson Makanda, and another to the IBC Chief Executive Officer, Marjan Hussein. And in suspending the talks, the Azimio team also accused the government side of not being serious in the engagement, as they had failed to cede any ground. Perhaps there would be some sort of development here. We'll be having a look at that as well and seeing what the Azimio side will be, how they will be responding to this call by the Azimio, by the Kenya Kwanza team on the bipartisan conversation. Well, also Rights Commission condemned state agents' actions during the recent demos. And we do have Professor Marion here is with regards to that statement they did put out yesterday. We'll get to that in a moment as well. Azimio set to resume protests. File ICC case over police brutality. Well, Azimio la Umoja and Kenya leader Raila Odinga says that anti-government protests will resume despite unprecedented horrors of police brutality, which he says will form the basis of a petition the coalition plans to present to the International Criminal Court. He was speaking yesterday, barely a day after the coalition called off today's planned protests and announced that they will instead hold solidarity parades and vigil for victims of police brutality, insisting the tax protests will continue. He says, and I quote, "I'm here to speak to you about the ongoing tax protests in Kenya, which will continue. We'll also talk about a problem we never anticipated, the unprecedented horrors of police brutality against protesters. With the constitutional guarantee for protesters, we never imagined that police would outlaw protests, confront protesters and kill so many as in the case now. We never experienced the state-sponsored genocide that is taking place." End of quote. That is what Raila Odinga, the former Prime Minister, had to say, and alleging that 50 people, according to Raila Odinga, died over at the hands of police officers during the protests. Bwana Waiganjo, so this is what is happening so far as well. The Azimio says it's going to take its case to the International Criminal Court over specifically what they term as police brutality, unprecedented horrors that was unleashed by the police. I don't know what your take is on that.
Well, it's perfectly within the light of that coalition to go to the International Criminal Court. But locally, we do have IPOA as the commission mandated to carry out investigations on these matters.
Correct.
So even as they move out of the Kenyan jurisdiction to seek justice, even within, talking on behalf of the commission, we are also compiling our data, and we will be forwarding our files to the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions to have him also carry out his mandate and prosecute. So we are working. We have evidence, and we have done our case intake committees. We're just waiting to tie up the loose ends and then forward our files to the ODPP. So even as Azimio goes international, I want to assure Kenyans that their local mechanisms have kicked in, and we are watching.
Why do you feel the Azimio team doesn't have perhaps trust in independent institutions like yourself here in the country?
Well, that's hard to tell, but when the ICC opened up to Kenya last time, I think institutions saw that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction in this country, and some people are taken to court. And perhaps the Azimio coalition feels that there is inadequacy of what the local Kenyan institutions can do, which is very unfortunate, because we gifted ourselves these institutions, and I think we should trust those institutions. And speaking for ourselves, I think we have not had any interference with the state over the work that we do. So our independence is intact, and even if our budget and our staff are not enough, even if our capacity has gaps, we have endeavored to do our best that we can. So it's important that the Kenyans trust their local institutions, because it really doesn't make sense to have an authority paid by taxpayers' money carrying out investigations, and then you leave all that they are doing and go and seek a remedy elsewhere. It's perfectly in order to do that, but it is much more important to recognize that the Constitution gifted us those institutions so that we can have our own solutions here at home.
All right, Professor Marion, let me get your thoughts as well on this Azimio set to resume protests, but they're saying they're going to file ICC case over police brutality. Do you agree with the opposition that perhaps this is the right thing to do at this point?
Thank you very much. Access to justice is a human right. And the information that we are getting from our human rights defenders and other partners from the ground show that there is an erosion of trust in the system. For example, when you have police and other agents go into judicial spaces and kick people out and harass them, journalists, families, friends, and lawyers, then there's an erosion of trust. So we would recommend that as the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, we recommend that the judiciary jealously guards its independence and the sanctity of the judicial spaces so that justice can be seen to be done. So we can understand why Azimio is thinking this way because of this erosion of trust.
Erosion of trust, Irungu, is it just really basically that lack of trust in our own local institutions to deal with this? Is it a lack and mistrust in the criminal justice system in the country? Where do you think the problem lies? Because, okay, ICC, we've been there before, but is that the way to go?
15 years ago, we had one of the most painful moments in Kenyan post-independence history. And that was, of course, the post-election violence, where we saw over 1,000 people killed, many of them slaughtered, and hundreds of thousands of people displaced throughout the country, and untold damage to the economy. And we said never again, and that's primarily what generated the Constitution of Kenya 2010. It was also what led to the very clear separation of powers between the executive, the judiciary, and the introduction of new independent offices. And I think that was an attempt really to restore integrity and confidence that justice would be equal for all and not weaponized by the government of the day. A few minutes ago, we listened to a former president herald the media for the work that it does to promote the truth and to investigate human rights abuses and so on. And you know, these are the, I guess, these are the pillars of a democratic, human rights-based society.
Right.
So it is extremely important at a time like this that the executive continues to give maximum space and does not interfere or weaponize any of the independent offices. I think what we have been very concerned about with the last 3 months has been what we constantly hear is phone calls from very powerful state officers to the National Police Service to take action on protesters unlawfully and to use excessive force. Or to detain people for longer than the 24-hour rule that they should be detained pending court cases. And I think the more that we see this, the more we see, I think as Marion has said, the more that we see the judiciary or even the courts becoming spaces where police officers can beat journalists and also people seeking justice, the more you create the conditions for people to just declare that neither the judiciary nor the independent offices, and there are some important ones, not only the National Police Service, but also the Office of the Director.
So it breeds the mistrust already. That is
actually breeding the mistrust.
Right.
And therefore, what we need to see is these institutions be given the full space to exercise their mandate and not have them weaponized by any part of the executive.
All right. And we have to take a break. However, I'm going to hold this next story when we come back a little bit later when we get into a conversation. Where's the Inspector General of Police, Jaffe Koome, amid brutality, meddling claims? Well, in terms of security, he says he wants the police to be let free to do their work independently. But there are concerns the police are being used as an appendage of the state, a weaponized appendage of the state. Is that the case? We'll come back to that as we wind up on the paper. But first, let's take a quick break here on AM Live. The hashtag, as always, is AM Live NTV at Zainab Ismail at NTV Kenya. Talk to us. We're going to be back in a short while. All right, welcome back to the program. You are watching AM Live as we wind up on what's making headlines in the dailies this morning. I'm not alone. Once again, just to reintroduce my panelists this morning, Irungu Houghton, Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya. We also have Professor Marion Mutugi, Commissioner from the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, as well as John Waiganjo, Commissioner from IPOA, that's the Independent Policing Oversight Authority. Once again, as we take a look at what's happening, I'm going to hold this story for a moment because it still concerns what what we'll be having a discussion on. But let's see what else we have here. On the Business Daily, Nairobi satellite towns making a fortune for property investors. For those interested in that story, you can get that story on page 8 of the Business Daily. And it talks about Nairobi satellite towns, among them Ngong, Mlolongo and Syokimau, making a fortune for investors in the property sector, even as the suburbs such as Upper Hill, Kilimani and Lavington are losing value. KRA raises tax on employed benefits. This dealing workers a blow by raising the tax rate charged to employers granting employee benefits. In the adjustment, the taxman has raised the fringe benefit tax to 11% for the next 3 months until September on account of the prevailing high market interest rates. Also, new vehicle sales dropped 12% on rising rates and pending bills. Sales of new vehicles declined 12.5% in the half year ended June, as the major dealers posted a mixed performance in the review period. Also, retail investors buy extra 51.9 million Safaricom shares. That is, retail investors buying that amount of money, the shares of Safaricom valued at 809 million at current price in the 15 months to June 2023, taking advantage of the telco's failing share price and a willingness by foreign investors to let go of the stock. And also, you can find in your Business Daily, push to relax checks on large cash deals gets IMF attention. That is the International Monetary Fund, which will engage the Kenyan government to ensure a proposal to relax the checks on large cash transactions by financial institutions does not increase the risk of money laundering. And this is coming after the cabinet approved a proposal to increase Kenya's cash disclosure threshold by 50% from the current $10,000, that's about 1.4 million shillings, to $15,000, that's now 2.1 million Kenya shillings. That's all you can get on the Business Daily, plus much more inside the paper. On Taifa Leo, this is what is captured on the front page. Nahofia nchi yangu. You can see there Raila Odinga, the opposition leader. Raila alilia mataifa ya nje kuwa serikali ya Kenya Kwanza imekumbatia udikteta kuendesha taifa. Makabiliano aahidi kuendeleza maandamano kama njia ya kushinikiza serikali kushusha gharama ya maisha, kupinga sheria ya fedha na kupigia debe mageuzi. And you can get that on the second page of Taifa Leo. Plus Syria kuishi hadi ufike miaka 100. Mzee aliyepigana katika vita ya pili ya dunia eleza namna ya kuishi miaka mingi sana. You can get that on the 5th page of Taifa Leo newspaper. And just also very quickly on the Standard, civil servants to brace for July salary delays. Well, efforts to upgrade to a new salary payment system for government workers, which seeks to boost the management of payrolls that have in the past been marred by ghost workers, has encountered hitches. That's captured inside the Standard as well. Raila, Kenyans united by cost of living. And also Ruto targeting big taxpayers in IMF probe. You can get all that on the Standard newspaper as well. And also remember that story of what happened, and of course who's fooling who in Suluhu's botched mediation attempts. And it talks about that statement by Raila Odinga, and of course what really came out from the president's tweet as well, who says that he's open to talks. And really, did the president of Tanzania come to Kenya to mediate among the two political sides? We are still yet to get answers on that. However, let's go back to our conversation this morning, and it is all about law enforcement in respect to human rights as well. We have witnessed what has happened over the past 2 weeks with regard to the anti-government protests. A lot of brutality has been meted upon protesters. That is accusations from the opposition, but also what the media had witnessed, and also a lot of destruction of property as well. And there is so much that is happening, and social media is even making things worse. There are so many unproven things that is out there. But the question that we're asking this morning as well, where's the Inspector General of Police, IG Koome, amid brutality and meddling claims? And some insiders, according to The Nation, are blaming political interference on the operations of the National Police Service for what it terms rising cases of police misconduct across the country. The nation has learnt that some politicians drop names of top national government officials to issue orders to junior police officers, which has in some instances caught their seniors unaware and unable to protest, as they cannot be seen to be contradicting their civilian bosses. Now, this, according to sources as captured in the nation, has resulted in clandestine arrests, prolonged detention of suspects, including children, and in some cases detention in stations outside the jurisdiction of arrest, with suspects being held incommunicado. The situation has been worsened by the executive's public backing of senior officers for the exemplary work in dealing with last week's demonstrations. Let me begin with you, John Waiganjo, on what you make of this. The Inspector General of Police has been eerily quiet despite the concerns that have been raised by all those organizations. KNCHR, we have the Law Society of Kenya, Kenya Human Rights Commission, IPOA itself were investigating these matters, but the person who's in charge of the police is quite quiet. Is that something to be concerned about?
Absolutely. The buck starts and stops with the Inspector General of Police, because the Constitution has given the Inspector General of Police independent command on the members of the National Police Service.
Right.
And that independent command, he cannot be directed by anyone to do anything. And even the institutions that are mandated perhaps to give him instructions, for instance, the Cabinet Secretary can give instructions, but only on policy. And the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions can also give direction to the Inspector General. But both of those two institutions must do it in writing. That is to tell you, the Constitution envisages a scenario whereby even those instructions can be, there's a paper trail on who tells the IG what to do. So anything else, the IG is independent. And if you remember, when the government came into place, I think among the first things the president did was to give the IG some sort of autonomy, financial. Yes. And secondly, he also came up with the Presidential Task Force on police reforms. So there's no excuse for the Inspector General of Police in what is going on. And his silence can only be injurious to him, because at the end of the day, even the president himself and his government cannot be said to be the ones who are giving instructions to the police, because the law is clear. He shouldn't take instructions from anyone. And I think it is so for every other institution. I think we have a constitution, but our mindset is the same, so that whatever is happening, the people who are mandated and charged with those mandates from the constitution are abdicating their roles. Because even if, for instance, this story says there are people who are infiltrating the National Police Service, but the IG is quiet and not there. But if we are to investigate, we will not be looking at politicians. Politicians are not part of this game as far as we are concerned. What we are looking at is the conduct of the members of the National Police Service, and by extension, also the members who are incorporated or who comes in to give reinforcements, like the prison service, like the NYS. We have sought information from those institutions so that we know. And we have even sought to see the deployment command, so that we know who are coming from those other institutions to join the members of the National Police Service in these operations, so that even at the scope of our work, we are able to know who we are dealing with. So in the absence of such information sought by an authority which is mandated to professionalize the work of the members of the National Police Service, then the buck goes back to the IG. So I think the IG is doing himself some disservice. He should be in charge. The law gives him that mandate to be in charge. His appointment is vetted by Parliament, so he's in office legally. So
his silence at this point is something to be concerned about. And Professor Marion, yes, before I get to you, Irungu, I mean, the concerns of political interference, where we're learning, you know, from insider sources that, you know, there's political interference where politicians are calling the shots on who to be arrested and what is to happen. This is something that, you know, is developing at a time where police are being accused of meeting excessive force and, you know, injustice is happening. So we should perhaps be able to hear from the Inspector General of Police, who is in charge of law enforcement at this time.
The silence of the Inspector General is loud. It is very, very concerning. And we would wish to remind him that during the unfortunate time when that was referred to 15 years ago, his counterpart then ended up in the ICC because of command responsibility. He has all the instruments that he requires constitutionally to operate in an independent manner. He should not take orders from anybody. And there is, as my brother here has stated, a procedure where he can get all kinds of policy information.
Right.
So if he's operating outside that procedure, then he should know he's operating in dire waters. We're saying that he shouldn't take responsibility. He shouldn't take command from anybody. So if he is, like has been suggested, and the allegations, as a commission, we have gotten information where people who were arrested, and we did go to those police stations, we got that feeling as well, that the officers who were supposed to make certain decisions said, we're sorry, but we have instructions otherwise. So we also want to remind those officers who have responsibility that they also have a command responsibility, and they will be held individually responsible, because that is what the law requires. And we also want to remind them that the police, it's a service. The new constitution reminded us that it is a police service. They're supposed to serve the public. They are paid by public financing. They are our employees, and therefore they should operate with the standard operating procedures that are given, and they will be held personally liable. But I also want to mention that if it is true, as has been suggested, that there were people who were armed and kitted and not uniformed, but for all intents and purposes, behaved like police officers in Kitengela, in Mlolongo, in Emali, in Kisumu, who terrorized civilians, then the Inspector General needs to come out and tell us who they are. If they are not his own, it still sits on his desk.
Right. Because
he needs also to rein them in if they are masquerading as his officers and they are not. And if they are his officers, then it is extremely, extremely concerning.
Bwana Irungu, where is the Inspector General of Police at this point?
So unfortunately, by following the news, it's difficult to tell. I mean, that I think as colleagues have said, you know, at a time like this, you have to lead from the front as an independent office. You have to be in the public, clarifying, you know, providing guidance, and essentially stating what measures are being taken to keep people safe. You know, the ostrich knows the danger of burying its head in the sand. At a time like this, silence is not a powerful way, it's not a powerful strategy of actually framing issues. It's not a strategy of providing leadership for the 100,000 police officers that are employed by our government. It's also not a way of giving guidance to the nation. So I think we have to say, you know, that this silence is troubling. The more troubling question, perhaps, is whether he's been silenced. Is it just silence, or is he being silenced? And I think that's the more troubling question that we need to ask. From the article that's in The Nation today, there are a number of allegations there, or a number of points that are made. The first is that there are very senior national government officers who are giving direction to police officers, whether they be commanders or junior police officers. That there are commanders that feel that they cannot contradict or even guide the operations of junior officers. There are cases where police officers have acted in contempt of court. I think one of the more interesting questions there that I would love to hear the Inspector General speak on, alongside some of the data requests I made earlier in the show, is whether there has been any direction whatsoever to the Internal Affairs Unit to basically investigate some of the human rights violations that we've seen by police officers. Is there just one case even of this? And I think the silence, as you know, the Kenyan National Commission for Human Rights say, is deafening in that sense.
Quite
so
loud.
I think we have to see a change of communication strategy.
Right. And Bwana Wanganji, when you're looking at that, I mean, so the IG is allowed by law to, and according to Houghton, to direct the Internal Affairs Unit to probe cases of police excesses under Section 87(2) of the National Police Service Act, which stipulates that the IAU can initiate investigations into allegations of police misconduct after receiving a complaint of an officer on its own motion following a directive by the IG or on request of either the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, the National Police Service Commission, or the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Has IPOA been in touch with the Inspector General of Police in terms of even a request for the IAU to look into some of these, you know, misconduct cases?
Yes, we have. We have sought to know from the Inspector General of Police, first of all, the number of officers who were on the beat in these demonstrations. Secondly, we have sought to know who else or which other formation has been incorporated in this, because we know for a fact that the NYS were there. We have even separately wrote to the Director General of NYS, and we have also wrote to the Commissioner of Prisons and copied the looped in the Inspector General of Police, because those are very important information for the Independent Policing Oversight Authority. Secondly, we work very closely with the Internal Affairs Unit. We share correspondence, and we also share files with the Internal Affairs Unit. But I hasten to add that we haven't had anything from the IAU that they are probing on these protests. So, and that's a fact. So, as we're saying, the IG needs to come out clearly, because he has to lead from the front. It is his constitutional mandate. He has to operate independently. Even investigations are to come, he will also be one of the people who will be investigated in the event that the atrocities caused to the Kenyan public. So,
but would it perhaps fall under, you know, individual responsibility? Because if I mention something just quickly as well here, Nation has also learned that some senior officers have washed their hands over the juniors over the excesses on the grounds that responsibility for any misdeed falls on individual officers.
Absolutely. In fact,
so then the buck doesn't stop at the IG.
There is also command responsibility, which is a well-established doctrine in case law now. So command responsibility and individual responsibility. So even the junior police officers must know, even receiving instructions or orders from their seniors, you know, like the way we're hearing at the instructions from above.
Right.
That defense is not available to them in the event of investigation.
It still falls under their responsibility.
Personal responsibility.
Right.
Zainab,
Yes,
if I can come back just on this point of IAU, I mean, it is not advisable for some of the incidents that we have seen to be actually investigated by the IAU. So I just want to clarify something. So where there are serious crimes, where they have it has led to the loss of life or serious injury of civilians, those matters should not be investigated by the IAU. They should be investigated by the IPOA. And the mandate of these two institutions are very different. Where there has been administrative, misconduct by police officers, those are the cases that need to go to the Internal Affairs Unit. And in a complex operation that we've seen over the last 3 months or so, there will be a mixture of these things. So it's really the administrative misconduct that we need to be asking the IG, surely in this entire 3 to 4 month period, have there not been any cases of administrative or professional misconduct that the IAU are looking at? But I think on the other cases, the more serious cases, we need to be demanding that there is full cooperation with IPOA as per the law in terms of their mandate to be able to investigate these cases. The second point, I think, relates to the point that has been raised by IPOA here, which is if there are officers from other units not under the National Police Service, like the Kenya Wildlife Service, like the National Youth Service, if they were deployed during this period of the last 3 months, we need to ask at what point was this gazetted? Because there is clearly a legal procedure when the National Police Service require the use of other armed forces. We saw this during the general elections. There was a gazettement, and therefore the mandate of the Independent Policing Oversight Authority was able to look at their conduct as well. If it is the case that there are armed units that have been used to quell the protests and they have not gazetted them, then the IG will be in violation of the law.
Would there perhaps, maybe, I'm just wondering, because I'm not aware of this, perhaps a legal provision that would allow the National Police Service to seek the services of another unit like the National Youth Service to come and join them at a time where there is no time to gazette, and, you know, perhaps there's a crisis that is happening and we have protesters on the ground. I don't know, is there a law that will allow the National Police Service to do that and make that call?
The gazettement is a legal process, so I mean, it doesn't take time to gazette those formations. So all that happens is a deployment order and then a gazettement. Okay. And I also want to stretch Mr. Irongo's argument and say that even us, because the Independent Policing Oversight Authority is the one mandated to investigate police action, especially where there are serious injuries or deaths in police custody. But we also have an overlapping mandate with the Director of Criminal Investigations. And it's a challenge to us because it appears like a legal gap. In fact, we've been looking for registration to see whether we can clearly demarcate those mandates. Because sometimes the independent policing will lash to a scene and carry out an investigation. Right. At the same time, the DCI, because the DCI also has a parallel mandate, also comes in to carry out the same investigation. Right. So you find that there are two parallel files, and by the time they get to the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, you find perhaps the police has gone ahead and charged one of their own. So the problem we have with that is that, first of all, where the police cannot investigate themselves openly because of the Brew Code of Conduct. Secondly, there is a possibility of a cover-up by the time the evidence gets to the court. So those two conflicting mandates, overlapping mandates, are problematic to us. But on the issue of the Internal Affairs Unit, our law clearly gives us the authority to even take up their investigations if we feel that the investigations are not being carried out expeditiously and fairly.
Even for the administrative ones?
No. The administrative ones, we leave them to the Internal Affairs. Yeah, the disciplinary ones, those ones are for the Internal Affairs Unit. But you will find sometimes the officers who are undergoing processes within the Internal Affairs Unit coming to the Independent Policing Oversight Authority to ask us to pick up and take over the matters within the Internal Affairs Unit. Because the Internal Affairs Unit is more like a department within the National Police Service, because they are clearly under the armpit of the Inspector General of Police. The Independent Policing Oversight Authority is quite independent. It's a civilian oversight mechanism on the work of the National Police Service.
All right. And Professor Marion, you also raised, as part of the concerns in yesterday's statement, was the issue of what you termed as special squads propagating allegations of, extrajudicial activities, if perhaps those were there. Can you substantiate if perhaps you have evidence or, from your preliminary investigations, this extra, you know, what do you call them, special squads that were working alongside the police, perhaps?
Thank you. Yes, we have information, and we are putting a report together, and we're going to release it, we believe, in 2 weeks. But the preliminary information that we have is that, yes, they were, and they have been some people who have been operating during the demonstrations. They are not uniformed, they are not identified. It is a requirement that police officers have their service numbers displayed. They did not have that. They were armed, and they seemed to be well coordinated, and they seemed to operate under a single command that was different and separate from the command of the uniformed officers to those scenes. And we do not know who they are, who they were. And that is why we're calling for the Inspector General to tell us, who were they? They were operating as security officers in the scenes where his officers were. If they were his own, he will need to tell us. If they were not, it's even worse. Then he will need to tell us that they were masquerading as his officers so that action can be taken. And as I have earlier stated, reports have come that they were reported to be in various areas, Mlolongo, Emali, Kitengela, and lately in Kisumu.
So that is something that at least you have some information on that.
Yes, and we are going to put it in our report.
All right. Bwana Rungu, when you hear that, I mean, that's another point of concern as well. We did see, I remember during the Mlolongo protest there was a bit of a scuffle there, but we saw police officers in a different, you know, donning some blue, you know, attire. In some instances as well, what we saw during the protest, especially in Kibra and in Mathare, I believe in Kamukunji, if I'm not wrong, you know, police officers in civilian clothing as well, and they would whisk away some of the protesters, so you wouldn't know. Some of them, by the way, were actually
assumed that they were police officers. We do not know.
So that we cannot substantiate at this point, indeed. And some, at some point, we also noted were wearing a press tag. So that again raises a concern of, I remember we had an SSU unit that was disbanded under the DCI. I'm not sure if we have another special unit, and really, what is the essence of having a special unit if really perhaps they were there and they were being used? What really was their work in this protest? Because we know essentially it is uniformed police officers who quell protests when things are happening, or, you know, enforce the law during, you know, protests and demonstrations.
I think we have to be very concerned by this new development. We were very clear last year that the end to secret police squads that were implicated in extrajudicial killings and forced abductions, that was a national conversation last year. The President spoke several times on this issue. We saw the disbandment of the SSU after the investigations into the 2 Indian contractors who were abducted, and there are officers now before a court of law, I'm told. Or at least cases have been developed on that issue, and the SSU was disbanded. But it seems to me that we are now going back into an era where individuals are either taken out of uniform and deployed with lethal weapons, and they discharge these weapons in the process of trying to keep public order. And I think we have to ask, what is the policy on the use of non-uniformed officers, undercover officers, and informers? And that would be one statement that I think would be important to reassure the country that there is guidance that is given to these 3 categories of officers. But I think the more important issue in the context of protests is really, you know, being clear that protest policing is not the responsibility of militias, criminal gangs, you know, officers who cannot be identified. It is the responsibility of police officers, and that's the only mandate that is given at a time like this in terms of discharging. But just to probe this a bit further. Whereas we cannot prove they're police officers. The fact of the matter is that people were arrested, and sometimes they were handcuffed. They were placed in vehicles with license plates, and they were driven to police stations where they were charged. So one would only conclude that these have to be police officers, because I hardly believe that a station commander would accept suspects from people that they don't know, or people who have no authority upon which to arrest them. So I think it's fairly clear that I think this area requires a clear briefing to the nation by the National Police Service and by the executive, because I think it is a matter of policy also. I think the last point I wanted to raise on this is the danger signal that it sends to individual police officers who may be asked to take on these roles. They may get the impression that because they're not in uniform, they will not be held accountable for human rights violations. And that would be a very risky thing for a police officer to believe at a point like this. There is no exoneration for human rights violations simply because you're not wearing a service badge and a police uniform. If anything, the charges probably will be even more severe because it will be clearly indicated that you acted probably without command instruction. But I think, as Kenya National have just said, is that the officers that we saw, the individuals that we saw making these arrests and transporting suspects to police stations seemed to be very coordinated. They had radio equipment. They had weapons. Perhaps those are the weapons that we need to be focusing on, rather than essentially these raids into people's homes that are not producing the kind of evidence that would justify the use of, I guess, guns during protests.
Right. Is EPO investigating this, allegations of what, at least what their position says is killer squad? We have organizations like the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights already terming information that, there are some special squads that have been set aside working alongside the police. We cannot substantiate really these are police officers or not.
Yes, indeed we are. I think the purpose for us to write to the IG to tell us who are involved in this process is exactly that. But the other silence we are getting is from the the Police Service Commission themselves, who are the owners of the data of their employees. Because basically the National Police Service are employed, or their human resource arm is the National Police Service Commission. And we haven't had the National Police Service Commission say anything. I think they are very sleep a lot. And it's a commission that should be very helpful right now, even to work with linkages with other constitutional commissions, including the Kenyan National Human Rights Commission and the Independent Policing Oversight Authority. And we have also reached out to them to ask them, because they're the ones who even should talk about the welfare of the police officers. Because we are also concerned about reports that are coming in from the state that the Azimio Coalition have sponsored goons to come and fight the police. We
have had allegations of armed militia who are working, inside the protesters to also, create chaos with the police as well. So that's another allegation, by the way.
That's another allegation, and it has to be probed, because now the government says that the opposition has people within it who wants to overrun and raid police stations. For instance, in Mlolongo, we have reports that the people who are actually in Mlolongo were ferried there from other parts of Nairobi, Kibra, and other parts of Nairobi. So the only people who can be able to clarify that either those who are officers or not is that commission. And we have not had that commission speak, even as the members of the National Police Service are condemned by the public. And we know for a fact, not all police officers are bad. There are some very young professional police officers who are out there to protect their country, but they are also log police officers. And now if they are militias, then we need to hear that commission system.
All right. And even with that, allow me to have a look at a statement as there was also released yesterday evening by the Interior Cabinet Secretary, Professor Kithure Kindiki. And he says, first, number one, claims that the National Police Service officers and other law enforcement personnel are engaged in extrajudicial executions and or excessive use of force against the public or any section thereof are malicious, false, and intended to distort public opinion regarding the recent orgy of violence that took place in some parts of the country. He goes on to say the architects of this false and distorted narrative bear the greatest responsibility for planning, financing, executing heinous crimes resulting in death and injury of civilians and law enforcement officers and massive destruction of private and public property during the past few weeks. He says investigative and intelligence agencies are analyzing solid evidence in their possession, which evidence is adequate to prosecute the key planners, executors, and financiers of large-scale arson, violent robberies, and destruction of infrastructure, as well as death and injury of civilians and security personnel. During the past week, a large cache of conventional and crude weapons, narcotic drugs, and cash were intercepted on their way to fuel the riots that rocked some parts of the country. Furthermore, it has also been established, according to the Cabinet Secretary, that licensed and unlicensed civilian firearms supplied by the masterminds of the recent violence were used to kill or injure civilians and security personnel, and the blame shifted to security officers. And also the scale of violence and destruction occasioned by the persons masquerading as peaceful protesters exercising their constitutional rights shocks the conscience of mankind. Consequently, relevant agencies of the criminal justice system will proceed to conclude analysis of the available evidence to bring to account all those involved, notwithstanding the antics of politicization and ethnicization of the grave matter of widespread lawlessness, crime, and impunity, in clear but hopeless ruse aimed at deflecting the inevitable consequences of accountability. And because I'm almost done, let me just finish up on that statement. The National Police Service and other national security organs remain neutral and impartial. It says in the coming days, weeks, and months, the masterminds of the widespread violence against the people of Kenya, including those associated with the huge consignments of money and weapons which were intercepted on their way to harm the public, have a date with accountability. Professor Marion, so this is a statement, by the Cabinet Secretary, and of course it actually came after you held your press conference, but he says the claims that any officers within the National Police Service and other law enforcement personnel are engaged in any kind of extrajudicial activity is false, malicious, is certainly not true.
The Constitution gives and notes many, no, it doesn't give, it just documents the various human rights. Some cannot be limited, meaning that you cannot suspend them. And one of the ones that cannot be suspended is the right to freedom from torture, degrading, and inhuman treatment. That cannot be suspended. Now, unfortunately fortunately or unfortunately, we have now technology that records many of these things. And like years gone by during the Moi era, which we seem to be sliding back into, and like that time when we did not have the technological advances that we have today, now technological advances are available, and we do not depend on what we are told from one source, but from multiple sources. We get clips in social media, and they show us what is happening. Bystanders on top of buildings take very clear shots and recordings, and they post them. We have seen an old woman being beaten as she was crossing a street. We have seen a person, a disabled person, in a wheelchair being beaten up. We have seen tear gas lobbed into a classroom and students, pupils, no students, fainting. If that is not degrading, inhuman treatment, I would want to know what that would be. Now, when the Cabinet Secretary says that it is malicious and false, I would like him to comment about that information that we have that is recorded. And maybe he should just ask maybe he shouldn't ask because he shouldn't do that. But the Inspector General should just go straight for those people for giving false information, because we have that information. It's freely available in social media. People have taken it. We have had those reports. So I choose to disagree with the Cabinet Secretary. Maybe he should review his statement and say that the majority of his officers or the officers are good, but there are a few rogue ones, because that is true. We also have noted that some of those people who were arrested and taken to court have been beaten up. There are people who have been accosted. When they were arrested, they were okay, but when they appeared in the police stations and their loved ones went there, or in court, they were beaten up, and they claimed that they were actually beaten up. Maybe he should tell us who did that.
But there are also the claims that even aside from that, it is within their own, they have the information that you have armed militia that is being used to terrorize law enforcement officers as well. You have unlicensed and licensed, firearms being used as well as part of this protest.
Zainab, owning a firearm is not illegal in Kenya. Both security and civilians can own firearms, and there is a procedure for licensing them. There is even a procedure for determining the expended ordinances, which firearm it came out from. That information is with them. So if there are some firearms that were used illegally by civilians, by rogues, or by whoever, they have all the facilities to tell us which firearm discharged those firearms and which licensed firearm owner, who is the owner. They have that information. So really let them take these people to court. Let them just not give us blanket statements. Let them identify them. The DCI will do that. And then let them say that the firearm that discharged this ordinance belonged to Irongo, and let Irongo go to court. And there is a procedure actually for withdrawing a licensed firearm. And there are the conditions. Let them do that. They have all that information.
All right. And on that point, I think we have to take just a very quick break here on AM Live as we come back on our last stretch of this conversation on AM Live. We'll still take a look at some of the statements here made by the Cabinet Secretary, Professor Kithure Kindiki, with regard to law enforcement, especially during the protests that we've witnessed here in the country. Let's do that. We're going to be back. The hashtag is AM Live and TV. Talk to us. All right, welcome back to the program. You are watching AM Live as we take a look at some of the developments here in the country, and of course coming at the back of what was a planned protest that has been suspended by the Azimio today, but also questions on issues of excessive use of police force on protesters, as well as on the other end, you have statements coming from the Interior Ministry with regard to the same. And looking at this statement from the Principal Secretary in the Ministry of Interior, that is Dr. Raymond Omolo, he talks about a number of issues as well. The government deeply concerned by recent pockets of violent protests that led to the monetary disruption of public order in some parts of the country. The ugly turn of events bore out the delicate balance between the right, peaceably and unarmed, to assemble, to demonstrate, to picket and to present petitions to public authorities, and the imperative to prevent the abuse of this right can also jeopardize the country's national security. And he further says that there's a new trend of negatively profiling, harassing and attacking security personnel that saw a total of 305 law enforcement officers seriously injured and 1 fatality while executing the cardinal responsibility of protecting lives and property. Goes on to mention a number of other things. The National Police Service losing about 158 vehicles, 9 police stations which were either burnt down or severely damaged by criminals masquerading as protesters. He says more than 850 shops and other businesses and premises also broken into and looted, 199 buildings destroyed and various public utilities worth billions of shillings vandalized. About 156 cases of assault and violent robberies were also reported, while several non-protesting motorists and pedestrians were attacked and robbed of their belongings by the rioters who blocked 69 roads during the demonstrations. Bwana Houghton Irungu, these are some of the statements that were coming from the Interior ministry. We saw the other statement from the cabinet secretary also speaking about the issues of accountability, especially when it comes to those who are planning for this protest, whether peacefully and really, you know, basically just looking at that. However, when we're looking at law enforcement in itself, how does it move and shift from enforcing the law during a peaceful protest that has been planned and falls into this really ugly scenes that we've witnessed during those, you know, times that, you know, the demonstrations have taken place in the country? Mm-hmm. You know, we've seen people injured, we've seen fatalities that have been reported. How does it shift? Where is the balance? What happens? Where's the gap? Yeah.
I mean, you know, we've said it many times, but the human cost is just too much, and the economic cost is disastrous, and also you know, the impact will be felt not just in this moment, but actually there will be post-traumatic stress that people will go through in either the communities or in those schools or in those homes, where the images of police officers going into neighborhoods and beating people, parents, people with disabilities, the elderly, that trauma doesn't disappear overnight. I mean, the headlines may drop, we may move on to something else, but that pain will continue for those communities. And the question we need to ask is, you know, whether this is absolutely necessary, you know. And you know, one of the false narratives is that there is no choice but violent policing. The violent protests require strong, hard, decisive action. This is the language that we saw in March, and we've seen the deterioration since then. Now, this is not a time for you know, the national police officers or the executive, or even for that matter, human rights organizations, to go and do benchmarking tours. But let me just give you a couple of comparative experiences from other countries that demonstrate that actually protests don't have to lead to the loss of life, right? So last year there were 12,000 protests in about 148 countries across the world. This is data that has been produced by Civicus. It was released this year. And what they found was that primarily these protests were propelled by economic grievances. So the cost of living, taxation has been a major issue for countries like Sri Lanka, for countries like Indonesia, for Ghana and others.
So it's not unique to Kenya?
It's not unique. It's not genetically a Kenyan thing. So that's the first thing. But the more interesting thing is, how is it possible that the United Kingdom, that has had its fair share of protests, either against climate change or against fuel costs, has much lower levels of fatalities? Let me just give you some stats. There have been 1,800 deaths in the last 30 years in the United Kingdom. That roughly is about 50 deaths per annum, if you, on average. Now, contrast that with the 30 deaths or so that we have seen in Kenya in just the last 3 months. If we continue at this rate, we will be heading to 120 deaths by the end of this year. So I think the first thing to say is, how has the United Kingdom been able to police its protests? But let me give you two other good examples that were very dramatic internationally. The first was in 2021, 6th of January, about 2,000 people climbed the national capital, the Capitol buildings in the United States, in Washington. And 2,000, there were 5 deaths. Only one of them was attributable to a police officer. There were 1,000 arrests. 476 out of the 1,000 arrests ended up in people pleading guilty. Now, my question is, how have they been able to do this? Let me go to another country. If these global north countries are, you know, too far for us to imagine the possibility of peaceful protesting in Kenya, or peaceful policing of protests in Kenya. In Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, in the beginning of this year, on the 8th of January, 5,000 people were transported by 100 buses to the equivalent of the national parliament.
5,000 people?
5,000 people in 100 buses.
Right.
There were 2,182 arrests. There were only 50 people injured, and there was not a single death reported. So my question to the National Police Service and to the Minister of Interior, if other countries can allow for protests as per the law, and they're not lead to violence, they're not lead to deaths, why can't we do this here?
That's a good question, but still begs the question then, because the accusations on both sides. Where does maintaining law and order stop and injustice begin, Bwana Ganjo?
I think the biggest gap in this country on the law on picketing is lack of proper registration, because the Constitution required Parliament to legislate a law on picketing. That would mean that that law would also come with the regulations. Those regulations would direct how picketing should be done. It probably would even designate areas where the picketing should happen. Perhaps that law would be picked by the members of the National Police Service, who would therefore know that even the notification itself would tell them these protesters would follow this route, they would have their ushers, they would know who those ushers are. That way, they would even be able to smoke out the criminals who would probably infiltrate those demonstrations. But unfortunately, in this country, instead of creating that kind of registration, we have seen a registration brought up by a particular member whose intention is just to crow back on the gains that this country has made in matters, democracy and freedom of association, and even that picketing. So for me, I think the first thing we need to do is to depoliticize protests. Because if politics were not a major issue in this protest, then we would not have two sides of, a coin. We would only have protesters, perhaps with their ushers and sponsors, who would be responsible for any damages that would come by, leading their protesters unarmed and weeding out those who are armed, telling those who have stones to drop their stones, and then we would have a peaceful protest. And we have had them here in the past. We have seen scenarios whereby people come together, march to Harambee House, give petitions, disperse and go home.
Perhaps, when Bwana Irungu did mention and give us those, areas where we've witnessed peaceful protests happening, it's because there was no politicization of those protests, perhaps? Is this the reason why we're witnessing
highly
them?
politicized. Right. The January 6th storming of the national capital took place in the wake of the elections in the United States. And the former president, who is now serving, or rather is about to go through several cases, legal cases,
right,
actively promoted his followers to essentially storm. And some of those protesters were calling for the death of the vice president, his own vice president. Yes. In the case of Brazil, it was
highly political.
Completely political. In fact, much more political. It's the equivalent of these mandamanos happening within weeks of the August general election. They were highly political and highly charged.
Right.
The difference was policing approach was different.
Was different. Perhaps that's what we need to look into.
It is interesting because the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights has worked with the police for a long time,
right?
Because of the historical image that we have of the police, to clean up their image and their standard operating procedures. And just during the last elections, we commended them for the very first time in the history of Kenya. The commission said kudos, because the police service behaved in a very, very professional manner. Maybe that is the proverbial that watch out when you're standing lest you fall. But I want to add to what Irungu has said and Waiganjo has said. There have been peaceful demonstrations in Kenya. We've seen them, we know them. Now, the law, unless you suspend the Constitution, demonstrations are provided for. It is a right, unless you suspend the Constitution. Now, when you want to have a demonstration, then you need to inform the police, not seek a license, but inform them. And the reason for informing them, among others, is so that they can clear out the route. They can tell the motorists that please look for alternative routes, and ensure that the demonstrators demonstrate in a manner, or they clear the route for them. And they make sure, probably they stand on the sides of the road to ensure that there is no interference from non-demonstrators. That is their role. But what do we see today? When a demonstration starts, the police arrive long before the demonstrators. So maybe we should ask ourselves, how did we ever have peaceful demonstrations in the past, and look at the best practice and go ahead with it. But in addition, I just want to look at the prudent use of resources, limited resources. Kenya, we are in an economic crunch. You've just been told that civil servants may not be paid on time. So we are in an economic crunch. There are areas of Nairobi, we're just recovering from COVID. We know that COVID showed us that there are parts of Kenya, for example, Nairobi, in the informal settlements, where there's no water. So when we said wash your hands, there was no water to wash your hands. So if we have enough water to use it against demonstrators with water cannons, isn't it interesting that we do not have enough water to supply to the informal settlements, and yet water is a human right?
All right. But I'm thinking about this. So in those instances where we go back to the examples that we've been given, where there have been somehow a more strategic way of planning protests, and this protest really having the impact that it was intended for, is it perhaps that we don't have enough regulation when it comes to how we handle this protest? Perhaps that is something that we need to increase in terms of the laws that we have to ensure that everybody knows their roles. That the police, this is where you stand, this is where you cannot surpass, and for the protesters, you have to give notification. I think that is already there in law. You have to make sure that this has happened, and so many other things that need. Do you think we need to change that, or do we need to add more laws to that?
Maybe we ought to ask ourselves, have the laws changed from the time we had peaceful demonstrations? They haven't changed.
All right.
They haven't changed at all. The laws are the same, and yet we have had peaceful demonstrations here. So, just December, August, we commended that same police service.
Yeah.
Has the police service changed? No, it's the same lot. So we're asking, what has given?
Okay.
What has happened? We are in a crisis. We are in a crisis, and there is no way, and we've just been given statistics. Everybody, many countries, people are demonstrating because of the economic crisis. So we are not unique.
All right.
Zainab, let me just come on this. Hiding in plain sight. Let me say that again for the your viewers who are just waking up. Hiding in plain sight on the website of the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights is a wonderful document that should actually be the most downloaded document over the last 3 months. And it's called the Right to Assembly. In that document are several guidelines that are useful for police officers, for the executive and the Ministry of Interior, for protest organizers, not just Azimio, but even those that are organizing from the social justice centers. And it lays out very clearly what are the the threshold of actions that are required to keep protests within the spirit of Article 37. So I think it's, there's enough material out there. And, there is a bit more work I think needs to be done in terms of giving them legal force. But I think if people are looking for ideas, let them just go down now and download and share that particular report. So I think that's the first thing. But I think the other thing that perhaps we could say to Kenyans at this time, there is only 3 measures of, performance that the National Police Service needs to be paying attention to in terms of how they police protests. The first is, whether they, the force that they're using is proportionate. Is it a match to the threat and the risk that is being faced? And now we have a court judgment that says it is not purely in fact, it has nothing to do with the potential for destruction of property, much as that is regrettable. It has to do with protecting human life, either the human life of a police officer or a protester or a bystander. And there has to be clarity around that. So proportionate use of force is important. The second thing is that force necessary? And we have seen, I think has been said by the Kenya National Commission, so many cases, and of course disinformation is alive and well, unfortunately, but we have seen many cases that have been verified of police officers, probably 6 to 8 police officers, beating the life out of one person who is lying on the ground in places like Kondele and Nyalenda and places like that. And the concern has been the force is not, in most cases, necessary. Most people have actually acquiesced. They are ready to be arrested if that is the intention of the officers. And I think the last thing that, that is important is the force being used reasonable, right? Now, these 3 standards, any human being, any person over a certain age, and I suspect even my grandchildren, can probably pick out cases where this has not happened. So I think what we need to ask all our citizens to do, particularly those citizen journalists that are very active on TikTok, WhatsApp, and so on, is to share truthful information where the standards of policing have dropped below these 3 levels. Secondly, we need to see prosecutions of officers that fall below this threshold. And thirdly, we need to see documentation by the independent offices, by human rights organizations, so that there is an accountability moment that will come with the documentation. And I think at this point also, perhaps if I can add, I think the National Assembly and the various national committees on human rights and national defense need to start looking a bit more closely at the nature of policing, because in many ways it is one of the accelerating factors for the violence that we are seeing.
Indeed. And finally, Waiganjo, as we move forward, and I found a jurisprudence that was out there. It was a case, Ngunjiri Wambugu versus Inspector General of Police and others in 2019. In the July 2019 judgment in this case, Justice Makau of the High Court issued an order directing the government of Kenya to formulate and or amend the requisite law and regulations to ensure that demonstrations are peaceful and held as per the Constitution, including inter alia prescriptions for demarcation of demonstration zones, responsibility for cleaning up cause, maximum numbers, consent of person entities. But the High Court also issued an order directing the government to formulate a code of conduct for conveners of demonstrations that include detailed explanations of how they intend to ensure non-demonstrators are not adversely affected by such demonstrations, and also provide a clear line of responsibility of who is liable in case of loss of life or property or for injury when a member of the public is aggrieved due to such demonstration. But I don't think there is any law or regulation on the code of conduct that has yet been, I believe, developed so far. Bwana Waiganjo, as we move forward, your final remarks.
Yeah, that's what I meant when I said that we need a legal framework.
Yeah.
We need a law on picketing. That already is jurisprudence, but it should be downloaded into a legal framework, a law that directs people on what to do. Also, the officers should also follow the law, their own law. They have a law already, the National Police Service Act, which directs them that if they cause injury to a demonstrator, they have to give that person first aid. They have to have ambulances following them, take the person to hospital and notify their seniors.
Right.
Equally, the seniors should notify the Independent Policing Oversight Authority so that we pick it up from there, investigate and find whether the force used was reasonable, was lawful,
right,
and therefore we can exonerate that police officer at that point, or we can charge that police officer at that point.
So there's that word accountability. I think that's the biggest part of it, because the word has been used by all sides, accountability.
Including the CS. That's the biggest one. And that accountability will happen. At the end of this full, at the end of this, people will meet on accountability forums. Right. And therefore, those who are culpable will be convicted, and those who are not, then will be acquitted. Indeed. So it's about accountability. And also, when protesters give notice to protest, we don't want to hear now from the state that there will be no demonstrations, because those are rights granted by the Constitution. Because
there's no two-way about it.
Yeah, there are no two ways about it. So you can't counter it by saying there shall be no demonstrations, because that way you have started at the wrong footing.
Right.
So let us respect the law and enforce the law, because we have laws in this country, but enforceability of those laws is where the problem lies.
As per the Constitution and with respect to human rights. Yes, Prof, very quickly as we wind up.
Two things. One, there are people who have been injured during the demonstrations, and information coming to us is that they have gone to health centers to seek health services and they have been denied. That is a violation of their rights. In addition, it is unfortunate because the health service providers are under oath to provide this service and to provide confidentiality. We have also been informed there are those who are hesitant to go and seek health services because they believe that when they do that, their confidentiality will be violated and they will be arrested. So this is an issue that has been flagged off. But I want to say that we are in a crisis. It's real. It's not the only, not only Kenyans that are in an economic crisis. Kenyans are crying. They do not have food on the table. And they have a right to demonstrate. They have their representative in parliament. They may believe that they are not doing a good job in raising their issues there. And the residual powers that are provided for in the Constitution, they are exercising them. And so, let us deal with this crisis. The President of the Republic of Kenya, His Excellency William Samoei Ruto, was elected to provide these things and to lead. Let him do what it takes. Let him talk to whoever it takes to ensure that Kenyans who are suffering, who are coming out on the street, because it defies all human understanding that a hungry person, instead of going to Mjengo, goes to the street. It shows the magnitude of the frustration of Kenyans. So let the government, the state, the president, the back ends at his gate, let him really look at ways and means of dealing with the crisis that is in Kenya. And dealing with the crisis does not include dealing with the demonstrators. It will only fuel. And to the CS, Interior, you know, when you're a father or a mother and you have children and you're called to school and you're told your children are naughty, it is not really wise to go and say, no, 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 my children are good. You say yes, because your children may be rogue. All of them will not be rogue, certainly. But it is good to recognize that his officers are good, but there are few rogue ones. And they are there, and deal with them so that they clean up their image.
All right. Bwana Irungu, as we wind up, your final remarks.
So today may be much quieter and more peaceful for many Kenyans, but I think our thoughts have to be with those people who are, who are lying in our mortuaries, who are in hospitals nursing injuries, who are in police station cells, and those that are in our courts. And a number of them are victims of essentially arbitrary arrests. There has been a trend of shopping for crimes, shopping for police stations, shopping for courtrooms, and like the Law Society of Kenya said yesterday, there is deep concern for the rule of law and the, I guess, the criminal justice system, and we hope that it will survive this moment. But I think our thoughts have to be there with the people who are going through this. And, as I speak, just so that it's clear, I don't make a distinction between human beings in police uniforms and human beings in plain clothes, not those police officers, but the plainclothes civilians. I think
either protesting or already just
the Constitution is very clear. Freedom from torture, freedom from dignity. Freedom from any attempts to undermine people's dignity, the right to life. All of these are human rights for all Kenyans and all human beings.
Right.
So I think those are my thoughts in terms of today. And thank you very much for a good discussion this morning.
Indeed, it was quite an interesting conversation, and certainly hope to continue having this conversation as we take a look at really what the next days will be looking like, because, we don't know how next week will look like, but we certainly hope that there will be some resolution on this, what Prof said, a crisis. We certainly hope something will happen. But Irungu Houghton, Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya, thank you so much. Professor Marion Mutugi, Commissioner, Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, John Waiganjo, Commissioner from the Independent Policing Oversight Authority as well. Thank you so much for coming in this morning to have this conversation. This is where we wrap it up on AM Live. Your World is coming up shortly with Winnie Lubembe. Have yourself a good morning and a good day ahead.